Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Movie Crusaders. My name's Sean Wasserkrug, and today we're reviewing the sequel to last week's horror film that came out on Netflix, Fear Street Part 2, 1978. Now, for anyone who checked out my review for Fear Street Part 1, 1994, I explained that it was a really solid slasher flick that had a really solid co-starring cast, not so much for me on the two lead roles. This film starts off still in 1994 as we follow Deanna, Josh, and Sam going to meet C. Berman, the survivor of this film, 1978, and played by Jillian Jacobs from Community. And from here, we basically get told a flashback story of the events of 1978, which takes place at Camp Nightwing, where we see the killer that we saw in the first film, one of the killers we saw in the first film, which was the Axeman, the guy who basically looks like Jason. And that's basically what this film is. This film is basically going to be all done, for the most part, in flashback, outside of like the first 5-10 minutes. And we get to see the events that unfolded in 1978, this time led by Sandy Sink from Stranger Things and Emily Rudd. They're the two main leads in this film. They play sisters. And we basically go through the events that happened on that one night that C. Berman is going over with Deanna and Josh at the beginning of the film. Now, for me, my main issue that I had when I said after the events of the first film was that 1994 I was super into, but I wanted to see what happened with the story past that film, but we're going backwards into a flashback in this film, and even further of a flashback going into part 3 that comes out next week. And I was wondering if that was really going to help or hinder this trilogy as a whole. The answer to that, yes and no. That's probably the best way I can answer that without going too far into spoiler territory. Yes, I still really want to see where we're going with the outcome of 1994, which you do kind of get to see by the end of this film. I do agree that basically at the end of the movie last week, they did a kind of a preview for this film. I think they gave way too much away in this, but it's not enough to spoil the film now that I've actually seen the movie itself. But I still think at all costs, if you guys have not seen part 1 yet, if it starts to go into the next time kind of thing, stop the film right there. Don't watch any of that because it is giving way too much for part 2, just like part 3's giving a little too much away by the end of this film. The first, I'd say 30 minutes of this film are pretty trying because they're doing the whole building up all these characters and storylines and all that stuff like a normal slasher film. You're at a camp, you're going to be meeting all these individual characters or fodder that are inevitably going to die. But we also start to see some of characters that we know from the first film, but just younger versions of themselves. Now, it does get a little cheesy at certain points because it's one of those things where they have to go, hey, blah, 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 person who's going to become this. It's like, you don't need to treat us, the viewers, like we're idiots and say the full name of a character who's supposed to be this when we know that that's who they end up becoming in the first film. It's like, we're smarter than movie reviewers or movie fans basically back in the 80s. We understand that this is the character from the first film, younger version. You don't have to say their whole name just so that way we make sure we know who's who going into this film. It only happens like 2 or 3 times, but still, it's just very like, is that necessary? It's really not. Once again, we do get some pretty cringeworthy acting and cringeworthy dialogue in this film. And a lot of that is kind of in the same spots that it was in the first film, with this shady side and Sunnyville. I think it's Sunnyville. I always want to say Sunnydale from Buffy. I keep getting thrown off every time they say it. But this feud between these two towns, and a lot of the horrible acting from this film and the previous film is when they're supposed to be acting super hated towards each other. It's cringy, and it's acted to the utmost worst every time they do it. And I really wish that they would just... It's one of those things where it's like how It Chapter 1. Everyone in Derry is always just a little more angrier and a little more violent because of what Pennywise is doing to the town. It's kind of like that here. It just seems like everyone can be happy-go-lucky, cheery, and then when something happens where a shady Dale or Sunnyvale character interacted, it's like, I'm gonna kill you, and it's like, wow, we've jumped a couple bars here. Like, let's tone this shit down. You're supposed to be children. Like, you're kids in this film. And it's one of those things where it's just kind of cringy. And the first 30 minutes of the film, or even up 40 minutes, actually, when we are trying to build these characters, it's just kind of as we're trying to get through it. Mainly because either A, we already know which characters are going to survive and which characters aren't, because it's a flashback. And so we're wasting time on these characters that we really just don't give a flying F about, because we already know they're not going to make it. It's not like a normal campground film where it's like we don't know who's going to survive because we don't know the story. Whereas with this, we already know who's who and who's going to survive and who's not. Yes, there are some swerves and some twists in the film that kind of can, change your mind on certain aspects, but we still kind of know the chess pieces on the board and which ones are going to get knocked off. So spending too much time developing these inevitable characters that ultimately by the end of it matter none in the film is kind of a time waster. Now, once we get to the inevitable part of the film, when we go into the cave, that is when the film really starts to kind of become what the Fear Street of the first film really was, which is a exciting, fun, really brutal campfire slasher film. The kills in this one, like I would say in part one, there's one, maybe two really good kills in that film. But in this one, every kill is brutal and it's rough and it is right there in your face. And another thing that I think we don't really get a lot of in other films that we definitely get in this one is they are not afraid to kill kids in this movie. Because in any other type of slasher film that we've seen, especially like Friday the 13th or any other campfire, like campsite kind of things, they always go after the counselors or the older teenagers or stuff like that. In this film, they're going after the campers. They don't care whether they're young campers or counselors. Everyone's fair game in this film. So it is a little rough seeing the axe killer. I'm not going to say who the character's name is because I don't want to spoil who it is. But then taking out like kids is rough. But that's I don't want to say it's a good thing. That sounds really bad. But that's a positive in this horror film because it makes it sure that everyone is basically on the board to be slashed in this film. Because normally I would expect, well, they're not going to kill the kids because they're kids. And then, bam, they just start murking kids in this film. In terms of the cast, like I said, the 1994 cast, they're still the same cast. When we get to the 1978 cast, it's basically ran by Sadie Sink of Stranger Things, who I think does a great job as one of the Bierman sisters, and Emily Rudd also does a great job as one of the Bierman sisters. Ryan Simpkins plays Alice, one of the other counselors. I think she does a really solid job in the film as well. She starts off kind of because they're trying to make her like, oh, she's the pothead, troublemaker, counselor, all this. But when we actually start to let her actually act and develop a character in the film, especially in the cave, she really starts to shine through as a really fun, not necessarily fun, but a really very developed character throughout by the end of the film. I'm looking up his name. Who's the other good? He plays the young sheriff, Ted Sutherland, who plays young Nick Good, who is the sheriff from the first film. I think he does a really solid job. I think he's decent in the film as well. And then, of course, the rest of the cast, Gillian Jacobs as C. Berman in the film. I think, in her small part in the initial action of the beginning of the film, I think does really good. And, of course, Benjamin Flores Jr. and Kiana Madeira return as Dina and Josh. They're both still solid. I will say Dina, as unlikable as I had for her in the first film, she's starting to kind of come around for me in the second film, and we'll see what happens inevitably in the final film that comes out next week. Olivia Scott Welch as Sam, she's still kind of in the same spot that she was by the end of the first film, so she doesn't really get a whole lot to do in this one. The rest of the cast on the camp, they're paint by numbers. They're kind of acting very kind of, very 1970s camp thing. That's kind of cringy, but it's also kind of necessary for the film that we're overall getting. My main problem that I got with this is that they've shown at least 3, maybe 4 killers that we know are not the focal point of these films. And I really want to know those stories. Like 94 was all about the Halloween skull mask killer. This one's about the axe murderer. And then the next movie we're going to, 1666, where it's all about Sarah Fear. And I want to know about the little boy with the baseball bat. I want to know about the other guy who looks like he's a mechanic. I want to see those killers' stories, but ultimately I know we're not going to get to see them. So it's kind of a big tease to see these killers and not get to see their stories, like we're seeing with the axe killer and Ghost Skull Mask that we got to see in the first film. So it's kind of a letdown when we see them pop up. Like, I'm excited to see them, but I want more of them. I want to see these characters, and also Ruby Lane. And like I said, we're going back to 1666, which, like I said, at the end of the film, there's a teaser for that in there. I'm not going to say anything about that because I don't want to give stuff away for people who have not seen it yet. But it looks like, obviously, for the most part, most of the film is going to be in the 1666, which, once again, I am more curious about what's happening in 1994. And the story is inevitably going to 1666. So we'll see what happens. I'm hopeful that this is all going to tie up at the end and be one very, very solid horror trilogy. Act 1 was very good. Act 2, I'm going to give a little bit of a notch to Part 2 over Part 1 because I think Sadie Sink and Emily Rudd do exactly what Kiana Madeira and Olivia Scott Welch could not do in Part 1, which make 2 likable leads. You care about Sadie Sink and Emily Rudd's characters, and even Ryan Simpkins' character in this film, whereas I did not care for Dina or Sam Fraser, but I did care about Josh in the first film. Like I said, the kills are more brutal. The campsite atmosphere, I think, works better overall than Part 1, but I think Part 1 is still written better for the most part, and is unique in a way that we've seen slasher films, a ton of times before, but it does enough to be different that I really like. Whereas the Campfire one is more by the numbers that we've seen many, many times before, but it still does a little bit of things here and there to have a little more uniqueness to it. Part 3, like I said, that's probably the one I'm least excited to see, so we'll see what happens. I hope to be proven wrong, and I hope to really end up enjoying that and bringing this trilogy to a final conclusion. We'll see. In terms of recommendations, if you've seen Part 1 and you liked Part 1, definitely check out Part 2. If you weren't a fan of Part 1, I'm not saying Part 2 is going to completely change your mind, but it does make a little bit of everything in Part 1 a little bit stronger as a whole. So it's kind of up to you if you want to check out Part 2 if you weren't a fan of Part 1. But if you are a fan of Part 1, definitely check out Part 2. Just like next week with Part 3, I'm going to be checking that out, and we'll have a review for that one next Friday as well. I hope you guys enjoyed this review. Going to my overall score, I'm going to give Fear Street Part 2 1978 a 71% overall. Like I said, it's a little bit better than the first one. Here's hoping 1666 can close this trilogy out and make a new solid horror trilogy overall. I hope you guys enjoyed this review. If you guys did, go ahead and hit that like, share, and subscribe on the channel so you guys stay up to date with all the latest videos that pop up on the Movie Crusaders. And of course, don't forget to follow us on all the social media outlets you see below. Coming up next, we've got movie reviews coming out in the next week for Gunpowder Milkshake. We got Space Jam: A New Legacy, and then we also have Escape Room Tournament of Champions. I don't know if I'm going to be seeing that one or not, but we are definitely going to have reviews for Space Jam: A New Legacy and Gunpowder Milkshake. And of course, Brian Michaels and myself will be back next Friday again for another episode of the Weekend Crusaders, where we talk about 5 movies that came out during that weekend in movie history. Our current episode's out right now, as well as the Black Widow review. So check out all those videos, and until next time, in case I don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, and good night, Movie Crusaders.
You're still here? It's over. Go home.